Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The scent of lavender and old wood always greeted me at Serenity, now yoga, a comforting aroma that usually managed to untangle the knots in my shoulders before I even unrolled my mat. I'm Eleanor, by the way, 53, if we're counting, though most days I feel like a patchwork quilt of ages, a bit of sassy 20-something here, a dash of sensible 40-year-old there, and an increasing amount of where did I put my glasses? The studio, with its polished floors and sun-drenched windows, was my sanctuary, a place where the creaks in my joints felt more like a gentle protest than a full-blown rebellion. That particular Tuesday, the class had been especially challenging. A new instructor, all youthful enthusiasm and pretzel-like flexibility, had guided us through a series of poses that left me feeling wrung out, but surprisingly clear-headed. As I was toweling off, feeling that pleasant post-yoga buzz, my phone, tucked away in my bag, vibrated with an apologetic tune. It was my friend Carol. "Oh, Eleanor, sweetie, I am so sorry." Her voice crackled, a familiar whirlwind of chaos and affection. The car, it just decided to impersonate a very expensive, very stationary lawn ornament, right in the middle of the grocery store parking lot. "I'm stuck, and I know I was supposed to pick you up." I leaned against the cool wall of the studio's reception area, a smile playing on my lips despite the inconvenience. Carol's car escapades were legendary. "Don't worry about it, Carol. These things happen. Is the ice cream melting?" "That's the least of my worries right now, honey. But how are you getting home?" "I'll manage," I said, already mentally scrolling through my options. A cab would be a bit of a wait, and the bus route was circuitous. Maybe I'll just levitate. I did hold that Warrior 3 for a whole 10 seconds today. Carol laughed, a raspy sound. "You're a saint. Look, I feel terrible, but I might have a solution. It's a bit of a long shot, and maybe a little awkward, but are you open to it?" "Intriguing," I said. "Lay it on me." "Well, you know my son, Liam? He's in town for a few weeks, helping me sort through some of his dad's old workshop things. He just finished up some errands near your yoga place. I could call him, see if he could swing by, and give you a lift." Liam, I'd met him a few times over the years, mostly at holiday gatherings or an occasional barbecue. He was a good kid. I remembered that much. Quiet, polite, with his father's kind eyes and a shock of dark hair that always seemed to be artfully disheveled. The last time I'd seen him, he was probably just out of college, all earnest ambition and nervous energy. Now he'd be what? Closer to 30, I supposed. A grown man. "Oh, I wouldn't want to impose on him," I said, a genuine hesitation in my voice. It felt different, asking a contemporary's child for a favor. "Nonsense, Eleanor. He's got nothing else pressing. And frankly, it would do him good to interact with someone who isn't his nagging mother or a pile of dusty tools." Carol insisted. "Let me just text him. He's a sweetheart. He won't mind. He's driving Dad's old truck, so it's not fancy, but it runs." Before I could protest further, she'd hung up with a cheerful, "He'll call you if he can do it. Love you." I sighed, half amused, half apprehensive. The thought of Liam, this young man I barely knew, picking me up felt odd. Not unpleasant, just unexpected. I gathered my yoga bag and my water bottle, the scent of lavender now mingling with a faint whiff of my own slightly sweaty contentment. I stepped outside the studio. The late afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and soft violet. The air was warm, carrying the distant hum of city traffic and the closer chirping of sparrows settling in for the evening. My phone buzzed again a few minutes later. An unknown number, Hello. I answered, Hi, is this Eleanor? It's Liam, Carol's son. His voice was deeper than I remembered, smooth and calm, not the slightly reedy tones of the college kid. Liam, yes, hello. Your mom mentioned you might be able to rescue me, I said, trying to sound casual. No rescue needed, just a ride. He chuckled, a warm, easy sound. Mom said you're at Serenity Now Yoga on Elm Street. That's the one. All right. I'm about 10 minutes out. I'm in an old green Ford pickup. You can't miss it. It's probably the only vehicle on the road that looks like it wrestled a bear and lost. I laughed. Sounds charming. I'll keep an eye out. True to his word, about 10 minutes later, a decidedly characterful dark green Ford F 150, the kind with a patina of age that bespoke years of honest work, rumbled to a stop in front of the studio. It wasn't battered, more seasoned. The driver's side window was already down, and Liam leaned across the bench seat, offering a smile that was instantly familiar, yet matured. His dark hair was still artfully messy, but now there were a few threads of silver at his temples, catching the light. His father's kind eyes, yes, but with an added layer of thoughtful observation I didn't recall. He wore a simple gray t-shirt that showed off surprisingly well-defined arms, and his hands on the steering wheel were capable, steady. He was no longer just Carol's son. He was a man with an air of quiet confidence about him. Eleanor, he asked, his voice carrying easily over the truck's gentle rumble. Liam, I confirmed, walking towards the truck. Thanks so much for this. You're a lifesaver. He pushed the passenger door open from the inside. Happy to help. Hop in. Mom was practically having a meltdown about stranding you. The truck's interior was surprisingly clean, though it smelled faintly of old vinyl, coffee, and something outdoorsy, like pine needles. The bench seat was wide, covered in a worn but comfortable-looking fabric. As I settled in, clicking the seatbelt, I noticed a well-loved paperback tucked into the door pocket. Some kind of history book, it looked like. So I began, as he pulled smoothly away from the curb. Your mom mentioned you're in town helping with your dad's workshop. That's a big undertaking. His father, David, had passed away a couple of years ago. A kind, steady man, much like Carol was effervescent. Liam nodded, his gaze focused on the road, but his expression softened. Yeah, it is. Dad was a collector of many things. He smiled faintly, mostly tools and half-finished projects. It's a bit like an archaeological dig, trying to figure out what he was planning with some of it. I can only imagine, I said. David was always tinkering. He was, Liam agreed, a note of affection in his voice. It's good to be going through it, though feels like I'm having a very long, quiet conversation with him. His words struck a chord, that unexpected depth, right there in the first few minutes. I'd anticipated small talk, polite inquiries about my yoga class, maybe comments on the traffic. But this felt different, more real. That's a beautiful way to put it, I said softly. He glanced at me then, a quick, appraising look, but friendly. Mom said you always understood Dad's quieter side. I think quiet people often have the most interesting things to say. I replied, they just choose their moments. He smiled again, a genuine, unhurried smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Well, hopefully I won't be too quiet or too talkative. Mom also said I should be on my best behavior. I chuckled. Oh, Carol, she worries. Don't mind her. Just be yourself. Where are we headed, by the way? I live over on Maple Drive, near the park. Maple Drive, got it. He signaled for a turn. So, how was yoga? Did you achieve enlightenment? Or just a good stretch? The question was light, teasing, and I found myself relaxing into the worn seat of the old truck, the initial slight awkwardness fading away like the evening light. This wasn't going to be so strange after all. In fact, I had a feeling this ride home might be more interesting than I'd bargained for. The old truck rumbled on, a steady, unhurried rhythm against the backdrop of the city winding down for the day. Liam drove with an easy competence, his hands resting lightly on the wheel. We fell into a comfortable silence for a few blocks, watching the familiar streets roll by. It wasn't an awkward silence, more like a pause between conversations, a chance to just be. I found myself observing him discreetly. There was a stillness about him, a self contained quality that was quite different from the restless energy I remembered from his younger years. He seemed more settled in his own skin, carrying a quiet sort of gravity. So, what do you do when you're not excavating your dad's workshop or rescuing stranded yoga enthusiasts? I asked, breaking the quiet. He glanced over, a slight smile playing on his lips. I'm a carpenter, actually, custom furniture, mostly. Sometimes some restoration work on older pieces. Really? I said, genuinely interested. That sounds fascinating. And fitting, given your dad's love for tinkering. Yeah, I guess it's in the blood, he admitted. I always loved being in his workshop as a kid. The smell of sawdust, the way he could take a rough piece of wood and turn it into something beautiful. There's a certain honesty to working with your hands. You know? I do, I replied. There's a satisfaction in creating something tangible. My grandmother taught me to knit when I was a girl. I still pick up the needles when I need to quiet my mind. It's a different kind of making, but I think the feeling is similar. Liam nodded. Exactly. It's a kind of meditation, isn't it? The focus, the rhythm. He paused, then added, Mom still has that lopsided blue scarf you knitted for her years ago. She wears it every winter. I laughed, surprised and touched. Oh, goodness, that lopsided thing. I was just learning. I'm amazed it hasn't unraveled into a pile of yarn by now. She loves it, he said simply, says it's imbued with your good intentions. His sincerity was disarming. It wasn't flattery. It felt like a simple statement of fact. I found myself warming to him more with each passing mile. This wasn't the perfunctory chore I'd half expected him to treat this as. He seemed genuinely present, engaged in our conversation. We were approaching a part of town I didn't often drive through, a slightly older neighborhood with charming, well-kept houses and mature trees that formed a leafy canopy over the street. The setting sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the road in shifting patterns of light and shadow. You know, Liam said, his voice a little more thoughtful, I've been thinking a lot about Dad's things. It's more than just stuff. Each tool, each unfinished project, it tells a story about his passions, his frustrations, even his dreams. I think objects can hold so much of us. I agreed. Memories, emotions. When my mother passed, going through her jewelry box was like revisiting different chapters of her life. A string of pearls from her wedding day, a kooky enamel pin from a trip she took in the 70s, each one a little key to a memory. Exactly that, he said, his gaze distant for a moment, as if looking at something far beyond the windshield. It's made me think about what we leave behind. Not just the physical things, but the impact we have, the stories people will tell about us. This was getting unexpectedly deep. I found myself both surprised and moved. It wasn't every day you had this kind of conversation with someone you barely knew, let alone someone a good 20 years younger. There was no pretense with him, no attempt to impress, just an open, honest exploration of ideas. That's a profound thought, Liam I said, and a heavy one to be carrying around while you're sorting through boxes. He gave a small, wry smile. Yeah, well, it beats trying to figure out why he owned three different, slightly broken hedge trimmers. I laughed, the sound easy and genuine in the cab of the old truck. Practicality has its place, too. It does, he conceded. He then turned onto a street I didn't recognize. Mind if I take a slightly scenic route? There's a view I always liked around here, and the light should be just about perfect. Not at all, I said, intrigued. Lead on. The street climbed a gentle hill, the houses giving way to a small, unkempt park area. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road, beneath a large oak tree, and switched off the engine. The sudden silence was filled with the sound of crickets starting their evening chorus and the distant bark of a dog. This was one of Dad's spots. Liam said softly, his voice tinged with a quiet nostalgia. He used to bring me up here sometimes when I was a kid just to look out over the city. He gestured towards the view. Below us, the city spread out like a glittering tapestry, the lights just beginning to twinkle on as dusk settled. The sky above was a masterpiece of soft purples, pinks, and fading oranges. It was breathtaking. Oh, Liam, I breathed. It's beautiful. Yeah, he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He always said it helped him put things in perspective. All those little lights, all those lives, makes your own worries seem a bit smaller, somehow. We sat there for a few moments in comfortable silence, watching the day give way to evening. The air through the open windows was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. There was a sense of peace in that old truck, a quiet understanding that flowed between us, unspoken yet deeply felt. It was more than just a ride home now. It was becoming something else, something I hadn't anticipated at all. A connection, perhaps, a shared moment of quiet reflection that felt surprisingly significant. I found myself thinking about my own life, my routines, the comfortable, sometimes predictable path I usually trod. There was nothing wrong with it. Not really. But this chance encounter, this unexpected detour with Carol's son, felt like a small, invigorating breeze ruffling a still surface. He was so young, yet he possessed a thoughtfulness, a quiet wisdom that seemed beyond his years. Or perhaps it was exactly of his years, and I just hadn't been paying enough attention to the generation coming up behind mine. Thank you for sharing this with me, Liam, I said, finally breaking the stillness. My voice sounded a little huskier than usual. He turned to me, his expression open, his eyes reflecting the fading light. Thanks for letting me. Sometimes it's easier to share these kinds of things with someone who's not right in the middle of it all with you. You know? I nodded. Do understand. A fresh perspective can be a gift. He started the truck again, the engine rumbling back to life, a familiar, comforting sound now. All right, Maple Drive, you said? Let's get you home before your ice cream melts. Oh, wait, that was Mom's problem, wasn't it? I smiled. It was, but the sentiment is appreciated. As we drove down from the overlook, the city lights growing brighter, I felt a subtle shift within me. The yoga class had stretched my body, but this unexpected journey with Liam was stretching my mind, my heart, in ways I hadn't even realized they'd needed. The conversation wasn't over, I sensed. There was more to explore, more to understand. In the shared space of this old green truck, the initial curiosity had deepened into a genuine interest, not just in him, but in the unexpected turns life could take, the surprising connections that could form when you least expected them. The streets we drove through now were more familiar, leading towards my neighborhood. The houses were similar in style, older, well maintained, with gardens just starting to show their summer abundance. Liam navigated them with an easy familiarity, as if he'd driven these routes many times before, though I suspected he was mostly following memory or a good sense of direction. So, this carpentry work, I began picking up the thread of our earlier conversation. Is it something you always knew you wanted to do? He took a moment before answering, thoughtfully, not consciously. I don't think. I mean, I loved being around Dad's workshop, like I said, but when I was younger, I had all sorts of other ideas. For a while, I thought I wanted to be an architect, then a writer. I even flirted with the idea of being a park ranger at one point. He chuckled softly. I guess I was searching for something that felt real, meaningful. And carpentry feels that way to you? It does, he affirmed, his voice resonating with a quiet conviction. There's a directness to it. You take raw material and you shape it. You solve problems with your hands and your mind. And at the end of the day, you have something solid, something useful, hopefully something beautiful to show for your efforts. There's a very satisfying honesty in that process. I thought about my own career, years spent in an office managing projects, dealing with deadlines and emails. There were rewarding moments, certainly achievements I was proud of, but his description of his work sparked a faint wistfulness in me, a longing for that kind of tangible creation he described. I envy you that clarity. I admitted, sometimes in my line of work, things can feel so intangible, memos and meetings and bottom lines. It's harder to see the direct impact sometimes. I think every kind of work has its own challenges and rewards, he said with a diplomacy that was rather endearing. My mom always said you were brilliant at navigating all that office complexity, at bringing people together to get things done. That's a skill, too, a valuable one. Carol is generous. I smiled. But thank you. It was nice to hear, especially from him. It made me feel seen in a way I hadn't expected. We turned onto my street, Maple Drive, lined with the mature maple trees that gave it its name. Their leaves rustled gently in the evening breeze, a soothing sound. My house was about halfway down the block, a cozy two-story with a porch I loved to sit on during summer evenings. So, how long are you planning to stay in town? I asked as we approached my driveway. Another couple of weeks, probably, he replied. The workshop is a bigger project than I initially estimated. Or maybe I'm just slower than I thought. He gave a self-deprecating smile. Plus, Mom seems to enjoy having someone around to boss a little. I'm sure she does. I laughed. She's missed having you around. I know. She talks about you often. She does. He sounded genuinely surprised. Of course. She's very proud of you, Liam. He seemed to consider this, a faint flush rising on his neck. Well, she has a funny way of showing it sometimes. Usually involves a long list of chores. That's mother code for, I love you and I'm glad you're here, I said, only half joking. He pulled into my driveway, the truck's engine idling with that familiar, comforting rumble. He turned in his seat to face me more directly. The light from my porch lamp, which I always left on when I was out in the evening, cast a warm glow into the cab, illuminating his features. Those kind eyes of his father, yes, but with an intensity and depth that was all his own. Well, Eleanor, he said, his voice a little softer now. We're here. Thank you again, Liam, I said, my hand on the door handle, for the ride and for the scenic detour and the conversation. It was lovely. The pleasure was all mine, he replied, and there was a sincerity in his tone that made my heart feel a little lighter. Seriously, it was nice to talk about something other than rusty tools and what to do with Dad's collection of slightly too short extension cords. I smiled. I can imagine. Perhaps if you find yourself with some free time away from the workshop excavation and you're not already booked for rescuing stranded yogis. I hesitated, then plunged ahead, feeling a surprising boldness. I make a pretty good pot of tea, and my porch is quite pleasant in the evenings. His eyes met mine, and there was a spark of something in them, surprise perhaps, but also a warmth that was unmistakable. I'd like that. Eleanor, I'd like that very much. Good, I said, feeling a little flutter of something pleasant and unexpected. Let me give you my number, so you don't have to go through the Carol dispatch system. We exchanged numbers, a simple, modern ritual that somehow felt more significant in the quiet intimacy of the old truck's cab. As I stepped out onto my driveway, I turned back. Drive safely, Liam. Will do, he said, that gentle smile gracing his lips again. And Eleanor? Yes. Thanks for understanding about Dad's spot and about the quiet conversations. Anytime, Liam, I said softly. I watched as he backed the old Ford out of my driveway, its taillights disappearing down the street, leaving me standing there in the warm evening air. The crickets chirped, the maples rustled, and the scent of my neighbor's roses drifted towards me. I walked up to my porch, not going inside immediately. I sank into one of my wicker chairs, the one that creaked just so. The yoga class felt like a distant memory now, overshadowed by the unexpected journey home. Liam, Carol's son, he was, well, he was a surprise, a very pleasant one, thoughtful, articulate, with a quiet depth that I found incredibly appealing. Not in a romantic way. Heavens no, it wasn't like that at all. It was a connection of a different kind, a meeting of minds, perhaps a shared understanding that transcended age or circumstance. The "you won't believe what happened" part of that silly mental headline I'd imagined Carol would use suddenly felt rather apartment, not because anything scandalous or dramatic had occurred, but because something quietly profound had. A simple car ride had turned into an exploration of memory, legacy, and the unexpected ways human beings can connect. I felt a sense of lightness, a feeling that something new and interesting had just brushed against my life. And as I sat there, listening to the sounds of the evening, I realized I was looking forward to that cup of tea on the porch with Liam. Very much so. It felt like the beginning of an unexpected and rather wonderful friendship. I went inside a little while later, the house quiet and welcoming. I made myself a cup of herbal tea, not the robust kind I'd offered Liam, but something soothing for the end of the day. As I sat at my kitchen table, the events of the late afternoon and evening replayed in my mind. The initial slight awkwardness of waiting for Liam, the sight of that characterful old truck, his easy smile, the way our conversation had flowed so naturally from his father's workshop to the nature of creative work, to that beautiful, shared silence at the scenic overlook. It was rare, I mused, to connect with someone so readily, especially someone from a different generation. There was often a gap, not necessarily in understanding, but in shared experience or perspective. Yet with Liam, it hadn't felt that way. He possessed an emotional intelligence, a maturity that belied his years, or perhaps was perfectly in keeping with a man who worked with his hands and thought deeply about the world. He had listened, truly listened, when I spoke, and he had shared his own thoughts with an openness that was both refreshing and disarming. There was no artifice about him, no attempt to be anything other than who he was. And in turn, I felt I could be completely myself with him without the usual social filters one sometimes employed. That moment at the overlook, when he spoke of his father and the idea of putting worries into perspective that had resonated deeply. How often had I let small anxieties consume me, forgetting to step back and see the larger picture? His simple act of sharing that spot and his father's wisdom felt like a gift. And my invitation for tea, it had been spontaneous, a genuine desire to continue the conversation, to nurture this nascent connection. His acceptance, equally genuine, had warmed me. It wasn't about age or him being my friend's son. It was about two people who had found a comfortable, interesting space in each other's company. I thought about personal discovery. I'd gone to yoga seeking flexibility and peace. And in a way, I'd found a different kind of opening, an openness to new connections, to perspectives that could enrich my own. Liam, in his quiet way, had prompted me to reflect on my own life, my work, the things I valued, not through any direct questioning, but simply by being himself and sharing his own journey. There was a subtle tension, too, not an uncomfortable one, but the gentle hum of something new and unmapped. What would this friendship, if that's what it was to become, look like? I wasn't sure, but I felt a pleasant anticipation rather than any apprehension.